ZMAX mule team. So gonna sharpen this bad boy up, see what kind of edge it takes, see if there's any problems with it. Like you guys remember back when Maxamet first came out, the issues with it, edges falling apart and things like that. And you know, a lot of that comes down to, I think, probably the way they were being made back then, possibly, as well as, you know, some sharpening technique, abrasives used, that kind of thing. I think that's hopefully an issue of the past for the most part. But I was curious to see how this would sharpen. So let's go ahead and get into it. You see the Sharpie on the edge. This side is at about just a hair over 16 degrees per side, or I'm sorry, 16 degrees, and this side is roughly 18 degrees. So I'm just going to keep it at that for now. I may reprofile it eventually and fix it, but you know, 2 degrees different per side, I don't think that's going to be too much of an issue in terms of the edge retention or performance or anything. So we'll see. But let's just sharpen this up and see if we can get a good edge off of it. Well, you can definitely tell it's super hard, that's for sure. That angle changes a good bit at the tip, as you can see, right? Well, it's matching all the way down, and then bam, gets to the tip and it drops off. So steels like Maxamet and ZMAX, and even steels like Rex 45 at 67 HRC, they're noticeably harder than other steels. So much so that when you're sharpening one on a diamond plate like this, it's almost like running a file across a hard piece of steel. It almost skates across, and you have to use a little bit more downward pressure just to get the diamonds to bite into the steel. We're just going to do a coarse edge on this. I'm going to leave it at this grit for now because I want to do a test with this grit. So yeah, so we'll finish on this stone, just kind of reprofile it, fix the angles all the way across the edge on both sides, bring that tip back in, and deburr it, strop it on 6 micron, and leave it at that, and do a cut test with it just to see how it does with a coarse grit edge. You can see after a few minutes here, I still got a little ways to go to bring that in, but this stone is one of the Sharpall diamond plates. I think I picked this one up on Amazon for, I believe it was $39 when I bought it. 325 grit on this side, 1200 on the other, which is a pretty good jump, but it cleans up pretty quickly. I've found it's not too big of a jump, but yeah, you could definitely make a case for it being, you know, 1000 or 800 grit or even a 600 grit, depending on what you wanted. But it is what it is, and I find it to be okay like that. And it's held up really well for me over the past couple years. I think I've had it for about 2 years now, and sharpened and reprofiled a whole lot of knives with this and a whole lot of higher end steels, and it's still going strong. So I've been really happy with it. I think it's one of the better options for inexpensive diamond plate. It also comes with its own case that is a case where you can put the stone inside of it, as well as set the stone on top of it and use that as your stone holder for when you're sharpening. So you don't have to buy one of these stone holders if you don't want to, if you just wanted that to be your only stone. So I think it's a really good deal. So I'm just getting after it here, trying to get that tip brought into the same angle as the rest of the edge on both sides. It was off a good bit on both sides, so it takes me about 10 minutes here to get it fully reprofiled and the burr removed. I chose to use this stone and go about the sharpening in this way to try and replicate a sharpening I did the very first time I ever sharpened Maxamet, which was a couple years ago. I've learned a lot about sharpening since then and different techniques, and I do things a lot different now than I did back then. So the reason I wanted to replicate it is because it was a bloody nightmare the first time I sharpened Maxamet. And I think a lot of it had to do with the exact knife that I got. And it honestly, when I first started cutting the steel on this exact stone, it felt like I was sharpening chalk. And the edge just kept falling apart on me. And I was having to remove a chip. And I think it ended up taking me like an hour or more and switching stones to less aggressive ones to get the apex to finally come into form without chipping on me. So that's why I'm using this exact stone and just kind of aggressively going after this and being a little careless with it. That's because that's kind of what I had to do to reprofile the one that I had before that was chipped. So doing it like this, like I said, this isn't how I normally do it. Let's talk about how I normally go about sharpening Maxamet now. So this is what I recommend. Number one, use the least aggressive, most efficient stone that you have. Essentially meaning if you've got, a new 325 grit diamond plate that you normally use to reprofile, don't use that unless you have to. Use your 600 grit to start with, or a worn in 325 grit if you have one that's been used a good bit like mine has here, if you can. Or even better, use silicon carbide, or use a bonded diamond matrix or CBN stone, something to where either it's worn in pretty well and not crazy aggressive, or it's made in such a way where the particles, the abrasive particles, are inset in some sort of matrix in the stone. Because with a diamond plate or a CBN plate, especially a lower grit one, those particles are sticking up above the surface, and unlike a matrix stone, it's like the edge running into to little rocks as you're cutting it, and that can definitely cause you some problems with Maxamet, or ZMAX, I would assume. But we'll talk more about that at the end of the video with this steel specifically, or this knife anyway. But that's number one. Use the least aggressive, most efficient stone that you have to reprofile. Number two, burr formation. Now this might be difficult, especially if you're a beginner, but try to wait till the very end, the final stone or two in your progression before you create a burr, if at all possible. The less burr you've got to contend with during sharpening Maxamet, the better off you're going to be. At all costs, avoid creating a large burr on one side, because that can really be a killer to a Maxamet edge, especially, like I said, if it's new. Creating a large burr and then flipping or switching over to the other side and going to cut that burr off can definitely make an edge fall apart or chip on Maxamet. So that's number two. Go through your progression without creating a burr if you can. And we'll go on to number three. Number three, if you can't do that, but do this regardless either way, but if you can't do that, what you want to do, say if you're having to remove some damage, switch back and forth every few passes from side to side. keeping the burr reduced to a minimum at all times is going to be your best bet, because that's really the biggest issue when it comes to sharpening Maxamet, is how you treat that burr. That's what's going to cause you problems and make it a nightmare, or it's going to make it a breeze. It depends on what you do with that burr. So that's number 3. Switch back and forth, and that's just a good practice for all sharpening. Doesn't matter the steel. Keeping your burr reduced to a minimum is the best way you can go about sharpening in general. Number 4, keep the stone clean. Keep it clean of burrs. If you do have to reprofile and remove some damage and you're creating burrs along the way and they're breaking off and you're switching sides back and forth, those burrs are going to be on top of your stone. And if you get a big enough one, and you know, it doesn't really have to be all that big, but if you do get a burr on top of the stone and you run that edge across that burr, you'll hear it pop and take a little chunk of your edge with it. So keep the stone clean. If you're having to remove a good bit of material, take it every few minutes and just wash it off under the sink and wipe it off and make sure there's no burrs left on there. Keep the stone properly lubricated at all times. That'll help keep burrs off of it. Keep, you know, some standing water or oil or whatever on top of the stone. That way when a burr does break off, it's suspended floating in whatever lubrication you've got on top of it and could potentially be pushed off the side of the stone every time you do a pass. So keep it lubricated. And let's see what else we got. Well, I really can't think of any other tips right now off the top of my head, but I think I pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover for the most part. So let's talk about this particular knife and how it did during the sharpening and why I chose to sharpen it the way that I did. So hopefully you guys can see by now, the point of this video was to sort of give you my experience and recommendations on how to go about sharpening Maxamet knives and have minimal to no issues when doing so if you sort of follow the recommendations that I gave you. But also, and hopefully I could also demonstrate that you can be pretty careless with the way you go about sharpening one of these and still come out on the other end with a really great edge and very minor issues, even if you're just decent at sharpening and you know how to get a good edge on a knife, but that's all you know, and you just do what I just did right here. You can do that, and on a lot of these Maxamet or ZMAX knives, you'll be okay. As far as this particular knife goes and sharpening it in this sharpening, I think it did really well. The way I was sharpening it and not really caring how I handled it and the burrs that I created and just being sort of careless with it, it held up really well, and much better than the first Maxamet knife that I sharpened, the Manix 2, where the edge just kept falling apart on me, literally with sort of the same sharpening process here. So I'm really happy with this one, and I think that shows that maybe Spyderco is doing a better job now than they used to. I had a similar experience sharpening the Sage 1 that I had in Maxamet, a very similar experience, and I think that this is, I mean, for all intents and purposes, at least sharpening it feels very similar. Super hard on the stones, takes a really great edge, a really keen edge, a very sharp edge, deburrs easily, and yeah, I really like sharpening Maxamet. And now ZMAX, even though it is super hard and takes a while to cut, but you can see the edge that it took here and how sharp it is. I did have one little problem at the very end of the blade where I was trying to even out the bevels at the tip, creating a lot of burr there, and it caused a couple minor microchips that I cleaned up on the Veneve 240. But other than that, it did really well, and you guys can see right here that it took a great edge, and I'm happy with it. So stay tuned on this. We'll do some more testing, edge retention, maybe some impact stuff. So if you guys want to see that, stay tuned.